let me introduce you to Aldous Huxley. And Aldous might answer the question far better than I do.
Well, now, in regard to this problem of the ultimate revolution, this has been very well summed up by the moderator. In the past, we can say that all revolutions have essentially aimed at changing the environment in order to change the individual. I mean, there's been the political revolution, the economic revolution, in the time of the Reformation, the religious revolution. All these aimed, as I say, not directly at the human being, but at his surroundings, so that by modifying the surroundings you did achieve, at one remove, an effect upon the human being. Today, we are faced, I think, with the approach of what may be called the ultimate revolution, the final revolution, where, well, it seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. This is seems to me the ultimate.
Sorry about that.
In malevolent revolution, shall we say? And this is a problem which has interested me for many years, and about which I wrote 30 years ago a fable, The Brave New World, which is essentially the account of a society making use of all the devices at that time available, and some of the devices which I imagined to be possible, making use of them in order to, first of all, to standardize the population, to iron out inconvenient human differences, to create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system. And
Standardized human beings arranged in something like a scientifically designed caste system. He talks about a controlling oligarchy that has always been there and presumably always will be. In the 19th century, that was largely called the 33rd Order of the Masonic control, or the Illuminati, and in the 18th century, almost certainly, those who wanted to control the people under the hoi polloi, the people underneath them, were, at least in the Western Europe, clearly those with vast wealth and the bankers who were in the process of acquiring vast wealth. That tendency for the people with vast wealth to want to A, hang on to it, and B, control the population that might want to seize it, has been with us since people started acquiring vast wealth. And the United States, I'm going to divide the world in which we live into some artificial categories. Basically, South Asia and Africa as one, the West as two, comprising Europe and North America. I haven't exactly decided where to put South America in this. And then the other two centers, that is China and its orbit of influence, and then Russia. There are tremendous cultural similarities between Western Europe and the United States. And one of the reasons for the conflicts, cultural and especially political and economic conflicts between Russia and the West, are that they really do have substantially different cultural norms and cultural standards. China itself comes in a somewhat different category because China is a self-regulated culture. That is, there are tremendous, as with Japan, there are tremendous self-imposed constraints on individual human behavior because of living in that culture. I could move to Russia and eventually become Russian. I could not move to China and ever become Chinese. Not only because of my face, but because of the substantial cultural differences. And in fact, if I were to move to Russia, those cultural differences, I would be asked time and time and time and time again to demonstrate that I was becoming Russian rather than being an infiltrator. Because Russia has spent several centuries trying to become part of the West. They have discovered that the West has betrayed them time and time and time again. The West wants Russia to be a vassal, not to be a partner. I think I can demonstrate that historically if I need to. And the Russians don't want to become vassals. They like their culture, and we will look for a few moments at what is happening to Western culture, and the Russians say, I don't want to go there. Frankly, as an individual human being, I don't want to go there either, but I'm stuck in this culture unless I choose to learn Russian, move to Russia, and abandon my grandchildren, my children, and my wife, and I choose not to do that. A young friend of mine asked, what is a young couple raising children to do if they're going to stay in the United States? She didn't add, but I will add for her, and remain sane. My answer was twofold, and that remaining sane is important, because how does a sane person behave when he or she lives in a genuinely and truly mad society? The mad society is living according to its rules and has imposed its rules on its occupants, but those rules bear little, if any, correlation with external facts. If I say somebody is lying and they are in fact telling the truth, but everyone agrees with me that they are lying, are they lying or are they telling the truth? In 2013, I think it was you, Don, who loaned me this book, Project Censored, and it's the 2013 edition of it. And they do good work. These guys are academics, Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth, but it was established by people before them, who look at American journalism, and then they have journalist students looking at what is published in the American media and looking for the stories that are important but inadequately or equally important, inaccurately covered. That has been getting progressively worse. It became monstrous after 9/11, and in 2013 these gentlemen declared a truth emergency. Let's see. For several years now, Project Censored has been describing Americans' general lack of awareness about what is going on in the country and in the world as a literal and ongoing truth emergency. This was in 2013. This was before the coup d'etat in Ukraine. It was before Putin became the enemy of the state. It was before Russia intervened in Syria. It was before the election of Donald Trump. If there's a truth emergency in 2013, what do you call it now? A truth catastrophe? What I answered my young friend was that first, you have to recognize that you are sane, living in an insane society. And you have to stop watching television 5 hours a night. If you watch television, pick the programs that are not going to contaminate you. Yeah, if you want to watch PBS, but don't watch the PBS news programs. If you want to watch Friends or Cheers, by all means, don't watch the programs that clearly are trying to tell you what the world is about. And if you watch it more than an hour, consider yourself as having imbibed a soda with 5 milligrams per liter of arsenic. Because all of the programs are feeding you the American cultural image. And the American cultural image is insane. So if you're drinking that image, you had better be darn sure that you are immune to that poison. The second thing you need to teach your child, because once you have immunized yourself against this insanity, you've got to immunize your child. You have learned to go along with the insane people to the extent that you have to in order to do your job as a grocery clerk, etc., etc., etc. You have to teach your child to be sane so that they know not only what is right and wrong, but what is true and false. But they have to be taught that a lot of people are insane, if not in a legal fashion, certainly in a social fashion. It's going to be very confusing for a child. You can't finish that teaching job until they're in their early teens. But you have to help them realize that they are French in an American culture. They are Chinese in a Japanese culture. And that's kind of hard, especially when the system from top to bottom is organized to produce a predictable product. We've talked in this group before about the 5 principles of secondary education, embodied in a book by, I don't recall the gentleman's first name, but Inglis, I-N-G-L-I-S-S, entitled, I think it's, Principles of Secondary Education. And the School of Education at Harvard University was named after this individual. And the first principle of secondary education is to teach a reliable response in the student to authority. I want you to reflect on that for a few moments. He's talking about education, but the very first step is how to produce a reliable product at the end of the process, so that this product will fit into the system for which that product is designed. Does it have anything to do with studying logic and the rules of logic, or the recognition of false logic, or the recognition of setting up a straw man? Does it have anything to do with recognizing that the laws, the physical laws of science are very carefully defined to meet very specific situations, and the so-called rules of social science don't have anywhere near the reliability of the laws of physical science? Paul Craig Roberts, I'm getting off on a tangent, but I'll try to get back to my major point. Paul Craig Roberts talks about the demise of the Phillips curve. Phillips curve is used in the prediction of economic trends as supply is modified by the cost of investing in additional equipment. That's the easiest way I can summarize it. And he talks about the demise of the Phillips curve. the reason the Phillips curve can disappear is that it is a description of how human beings behave under certain circumstances, how a mass community behaves in an economic sense under certain circumstances. So it's not a law, it's an observed pattern. Whereas, if I push against this table, one of two things is going to happen. The table is going to push back, or the table is going to move. Action and reaction. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, I can't explain that because the actual implications of the law of reaction, action and reaction, are really quite subtle. I can explain a few other reactions though. If I toss metallic sodium into a glass of water, I can describe with relatively precise words how the sodium is going to react with the hydrogen, with the water molecule, and it's going to rapidly seize the oxygen atom in there and release its electrons to the hydrogen atoms that are part of the water molecule. And the hydrogen atoms are going to combine and form hydrogen, dihydrogen, which is hydrogen gas, and that's going to bubble to the top. It's going to get so hot that that hydrogen gas is going to ignite with the oxygen in the air. We're going to have one nice little fire. That's going to happen as long as there is oxygen in the gas above the water, and the hydrogen is going to be released if there's nothing above the water, in which case you're just going to have hydrogen gas released. The laws of physical science are much less elastic than the laws of social science. They're virtually inelastic, but I'm going to have to qualify that because that's not entirely true. But in principle, it is true. So now, we're talking about the conspiracy, and Huxley is talking about the production of a consistent product. A dear friend of mine, Virginia S., and her husband have been friends of Peggy's and mine for going back to mid-60s, essentially 50 years. I had the privilege of assisting her husband in becoming comfortable while he was under morphine therapy as he was dying. And I call it a privilege because they were dear friends. There was one thing that I could physically do for them that was helpful, wasn't going to stop his dying, was going to make him comfortable. And I had the privilege of providing him with that service. Since then, she has remained a dear friend with Peggy and myself. And each time we get together to discuss A, B, C, and D, she asks me in one way or another for some encouraging information. And it gets progressively, I'm not a pessimist. I pride myself on being both a scientist and a realist. So I would say that the realistic assessment of where individual human beings are in Western society is that the culture is decaying. You can work at preventing the decay. You can prevent your own decay, but the probability of your reversing the cultural decay is very, very slim. Now, I've said several things there. In terms of preventing your own decay, I go back to turning off television, try reading for a change, or find a few people with whom you can discuss things other than Donald Trump, other than the weather, other than your favorite TV programs. It is said, and I think there's some truth to it, that, and I know there's some truth to it if I phrase it this way, some people discuss people. These are the same people who buy certain magazines at the checkout counter. Other people discuss events. This is a different, this is a group of people who are centered on a somewhat larger view than discussing whoever the favorite actor or actress is now. The third group of people are people who discuss ideas. And I have no great particular affection for Chris Hedges, but I'm very pleased to have him say recently that the reason he is a socialist is that it's the only way he sees for preventing the total collapse of human culture. Said simply, either you're going to have the oligarchs reducing you and me to a state of servitude, or you're going to have culture recreated so that it is serving all humanity rather than the 1%. And I think that's an accurate way of describing where human history is heading. George Orwell said that if you want a description of human history, imagine a boot stomping on a human face forever. I hope to God he's wrong, but that is the logical conclusion of one of those cultural patterns. The logical conclusion of the other cultural pattern is a group of people learning to live with and for one another rather than exclusively for themselves. And there are all kinds of details. The very fact that there are 16 different forms of social democrats in Europe tells you that there are a multitude of ways of expressing that sense of socialism. And the same problems came up, by the way, in reviewing for a number of things. I've looked at the philosophical conflicts between Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Franklin in the writing of the American Constitution. The Articles of Confederation are the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. That's the official title. By including that as their official title, the states were committing themselves to a perpetual union. When the wealthy people in 1787 got together to revise the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, they were not authorized to do what they did. What they did was they tossed them out. In the process of tossing them out, they also tossed out this added article to the title and perpetual union. The point that I am making is that when the representatives of certain states affirmed and sought the affirmation of their individual state representative bodies, they abandoned the idea of perpetual union. When they signed on to the U.S. Constitution, each one of those representative bodies implicitly recognized and believed, in many cases consciously believed, that since they had the right to voluntarily join, they also had the right to voluntarily leave. I want to know that so can those of you who have been in the class before know that we have talked about the so-called Civil War and the reasons and the origins of the Civil War. Every other nation state that involved itself in the practice of human slavery in the 18th and 19th century successfully divorced themselves from human slavery non-violently. Mostly they did it by the individual states compensating the slave owners with some percentage of the commercial value of that slave. And by a variety of means, either moving the slaves, the former slaves, to another location, or incorporating them into the society per se. There were very few Europeans who were very keen on having Africans as citizens in their locale. France eventually reneged on that. In England, it was a very slow process for the African British citizen to become truly a full citizen. But they didn't go to war with anybody. In the United States, there was I'm again off topic because I want to get back to my subject. But in the United States, the conflict between the northern industrialists and the southern agrarians was not over slavery. It was over whether the southern states were going to have to pay the heavy tariff that was being imposed by the federal government on the importation of foreign industrial goods. Because the South was primarily agrarian, they were importing items that the largely eastern northern United States were not. Now, we had not yet got to the point where the Midwest was a major agricultural center. The Midwest was still being populated at this point in time by Germans and Irish. Eastern Europeans had not started flocking into the United States yet. In fact, I asked myself, how did they get a bunch of new immigrants to fight for the Union? And it occurred to me that they were fighting for the Union because it was the Union that had led them into the new country. It was not Virginia or Ohio. It was the federal Union that had let them in, and therefore they were willing to fight to preserve the Union. And the South was willing to fight because they had voluntarily joined that Union and they felt they had the right to voluntarily leave. Now, again, I've got myself off subject. You asked the nature of the conspiracy, and the conspiracy wants a reproducible, predictable product. This thesis goes all the way back to Prussia. It was introduced into American education in the middle of the 19th century, where the citizens existed for the benefit of the state. Not at all an English, British, or for that matter, French concept. But in Prussia, women in the 17th century in the Prussian sector of what was primarily a German populated area, women had to register the onset of their menses, because the onset of their menses was a key factor in the procreation of Prussian citizens, which was a key factor in the management of the Prussian society. And the Prussian model, Prussian educational model, was to have half of the percent, 0.5% of the population was trained to be educated. I'm using the word educated very carefully. They were taught to think relationally. They were taught to use logic. They were taught to see the connections between events in history and events in science and events in economics. They were taught to think relationally. As Carroll Quigley said, I can teach a person to be a manager, but I cannot teach him to be a manager if he has not already thought to think relationally. An additional 5% in Prussian society was trained to be problem solvers. The engineer, the chemist, the lawyer, the doctor, so that they'd be expert in a small area and basically incompetent in any other area. Unfortunately, certain specialists today think that they are omnicompetent when they are basically monocompetent. And they are indeed highly monocompetent. And as soon as they step over into another, they are not reflecting their competence in their one area, they are reflecting their brainwashing. Either that or they're reflecting the fear that has been instilled in them. Those of you who already know that 9/11 was not as the government has told you will know that Noam Chomsky is either a liar or a fool, and I don't think he's a fool. The Noam Chomsky says he doesn't know what the significance of finding thermite in the dust of 9/11 was. Well, if I find traces of dynamite in my house that has been destroyed, I think it's a reasonable assumption that dynamite was used in the process of that destruction. Noam Chomsky is unwilling to draw that conclusion. He doesn't make. Now, the nature of the control is what I want to discuss a little bit today. And why I am fairly skeptical about the ability of us to change the course of our cultural decline. I want to show you how corporations are interrelated one with another. That wrong. This is an illustration of the relationship of individual people on various, I'm going to put another one on first. This is a diagram of the connections between the board of directors of Citigroup and the boards of directors of a host of other major corporations. So that if you are a member of the board on Citigroup, you have connections and influence on Comcast, RHR Corporation, Aetna Incorporated, Electronic Data Systems, Halliburton, AT&T, Calpine Corporation, Raytheon. I'll bet if I look carefully, I'll find several other industrial complexes. Lucent Technologies, Ford Motor Company. You have potential influence on the boards of directors of those corporations. Now, let's look at the connection between any individual board member and observe that he or she has connections with all of these other people on other boards of directors. There are between 200 and 2,000 people in the world who, if they wanted to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide emitted into the air, could and would do so. The very fact that they don't tells you a great deal about what they know and what you don't. I want that to soak in for a bit. If the United States, how shall I put this? It is assumed that the First World War was almost an accident. It may be the case that when wars were fought for national dignity in the 19th and 18th century, that some wars, especially the minor wars, were in fact somebody getting their back up because somebody else offending them. War in the 20th and the 21st century are not accidental. They take place because people in power want them to take place, largely for either political or economic reasons. In the case of the First World War, there were people who were pushing for France to recover Alsace-Lorraine, and there were others, interestingly enough, who actually got out of the war before it was over, who wanted who wanted Russia to have control of the Bosphorus and the channels from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. This was their goal. They said about it. There was a third group that did not so much want the war, but wanted a certain result from the war. They wanted to have possession of Palestine, and by manipulating the great powers, they achieved it. This gentleman reflects several realities. I'll talk about the several realities in a moment.
It's going to crash and it's going to fall pretty hard because markets are ruled right now by fear. Investors and the big money, the smart money, I'm talking about the big funds, the hedge funds, the institutions, they don't buy this rescue plan. They basically, they know the market is toast. They know the stock market is finished. The euro, as far as they're concerned, they don't really care. They're moving their money away to safer assets, like treasury bonds, 30-year bonds, and the US dollar. So it's not going to work.
We keep hearing that whatever the politicians are suggesting, and admittedly it's all been rather woolly so far, isn't right. Can you pin down exactly what would keep investors happy, make them feel more confident?
That's a tough one. Personally, it doesn't matter. See, I'm a trader. I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I go with if I see an opportunity to make money, I go with that. So for most traders, it's not about, we don't really care that much how they're going to fix the economy, how they're going to fix the whole situation. Our job is to make money from it. And personally, I've been dreaming of this one for 3 years. I have a confession, which is I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. I dream of another moment like this. Why? Because people don't seem to maybe remember, but the 30s depression, the depression in the 30s, wasn't just about the market crash. There were some people who were prepared to make money from that crash. And I think anybody can do that. It isn't just for some people in the elite. Anybody can actually make money. It's an opportunity. When the market crashes, when the euro and the big stock markets crash, if you know what to do, if you have the right plan set up, you can make a lot of money from this. For example, hedging strategies is one. Then investing in bonds, treasury bonds, that sort of stuff.
If you could see the people around me, jaws have collectively dropped at what you've just said. I mean, we appreciate your candour, however, it doesn't help the rest of us, does it, or the rest of the Eurozone?
Say this, listen. I would say this to everybody who's watching this. This economic crisis is like a cancer. If you just wait and wait thinking this is going to go away, just like a cancer, it's going to grow and it's going to be too late. What I would say to everybody is get prepared. This is not a time right now to wishful thinking the government is going to sort things out. The governments don't rule the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world. Goldman Sachs does not care about this rescue package, neither does the big funds. So actually, what I would actually tell people, I want to help people. People can make money from this. It isn't just traders. What they need to do is learn about how to make money from a downward market. The first thing people should do is protect their assets, protect what they have. Because in less than 12 months, my prediction is the savings of millions of people is going to vanish. And this is just the beginning. So I would say be prepared and act now. The biggest risk people can take right now is not acting.
Alessio Rastani, thank you very much for talking to us.
Do you dream about economy at night?
I try not to.
Yeah.
Nightmare.
18 minutes past 11.
What year was that, right during the bailout time?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
The bailout time, 2008, was very similar to 1930 and somewhere in about 1877. And you could almost superimpose them in terms of the sequence of events and what was done in order to protect the wealthy from the consequences of their own gambling. That young man whose candor I do applaud is reflected also in George Soros.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
All of the above.
All of the above. Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia
Yes.
said that The region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculators from lampposts.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.
This man is a carnivore of the first order.
Jim Grant is the editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer and one of Wall Street's most respected analysts. He never tires of watching Soros, in part because of the huge bets he's willing to place on his hunches.
He is.
The young man earlier said governments don't run things, Goldman Sachs does. And Soros just said that I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of my actions. I would submit that those are two remarkably candid reflections of what has happened to American culture or Western culture. When the Articles of Confederation were drawn up, there was a cultural standard. In fact, Joseph Farrell does a very good job of summarizing that cultural standard. There was a cultural standard predicated on the Old Testament, whereas a covenant, the idea of a legally binding agreement between entities. Now, frankly, that understanding of covenant was broken, besides a multitude of other times, in 1991 or 92. Steve Cohen has an article, I think it's in The Nation, where he decries the fact, A, that George Herbert Walker Bush and George Baker and Helmut Kohl and a number of other people lied to Mikhail Gorbachev. They promised not to move NATO 1 inch further east. Now, those of us who followed the literature up to now have known that for years. The reason Steve Cohen draws attention to it is, as an academic, he now has documents that have been declassified that demonstrates what people have been testifying to for several years. So it may come as a surprise to Dr. Cohen, whom I respect deeply. It doesn't come as a surprise to anybody else. The United States government and its representatives have been lying to the representatives of the Russian government for the last roughly 27 years. Although I don't admire him at all as a president, at least Ronald Reagan told Mikhail Gorbachev the truth. George Herbert Walker didn't. The point that I'm making is that A, Russia has now concluded that the United States is not capable of making and keeping an agreement. Kind of like negotiating with my 9-year-old grandson. He cannot make an agreement and keep himself to it. I'll know that he's starting to grow up when he can make me a promise and keep it without my nagging him. I expect that of a 9-year-old. I don't expect it of the government of a superpower. But international relations and interhuman relations rely on people being able to make a contract. This is part of the cultural tradition that was evident to the framers of the Constitution. I'm going to reverse the order that Dr. Farrell mentions them. The second is a respect for the legitimacy of the methodology and discoveries of legitimate science. The laws of physics are the laws of physics, whether I like them or not. The principles of chemistry are the principles of chemistry, whether I want that hydrogen gas to explode or not. Mathematics is mathematics is mathematics. I almost went into math. If I'd had one slightly better teacher, I probably would have. Because math tells you the truth. It doesn't lie to you. 2 plus 2 is going to be 4, whether you like it or not. And when you know you are being manipulated, you are being told that 2 plus 2 equals 5. And when Donald Trump tells you that 2 plus 2 is 5, either the laws of math have changed or Donald Trump is lying through his nose. And Donald Trump says a host of things that if he believes them, he's stupid, and if he doesn't believe them, he's a liar. So, but that's nothing new about Donald Trump. Politicians have been lying to their people for years and years and years. They have not been lying to their fellow diplomats. And when they do, they are quite intentionally flirting with war. Don't let that soak in for a bit. They are intentionally attempting, they are in that one act of negotiation, they have abandoned the role of living with and helping their fellow man to the role of being the carnivore looking for the opportunity to devour his fellow man. And that, if somebody can describe for me a third ultimate end for the human species, I ask him to do so. Covenant, the laws of science, etc. The third that Dr. Farrell mentions is an understanding of the Logos. I don't want to get theological here. If Catherine were here, I might get theological because first chapter of the Gospel according to John goes into the importance of the Logos. But from a philosophical point of view, the principle of reason reflects the principle that human beings are spiritual as well as material beings. And that if any cultural pattern diminishes or abandons that spiritual aspect of the human animal, they are at risk of interpreting a multidimensional creature in 2 dimensions. You can do it, but the creature is diminished by having those other dimensions squished down into the 2 dimensions. Now, when we're talking about the control of the hoi polloi, the control of the masses, it may well be that those who are in control of that process don't care about the spiritual dimensions of human beings. I personally do. Not from a religious point of view, although I could defend it from that point of view, but from the point of view of art, from the point of view of creativity, from the point of view of creating music. You cannot ask a 2-dimensional individual to create music or to create magnificent art. It doesn't happen. That's not what creativity is about. So those are 3 principles of Western culture on which the writers of the Constitution were assuming that these elements of human culture were going to be the foundation on which the Constitution was enacted. And they recognized, by the way, that they could not establish in law all of those elements which were necessary for a healthy society. A healthy society relied on a basis of culture for the 1,600 laws that are unwritten, with a superstructure imposed on those 1,600 of 10 laws, if it's the 10 Commandments, or 3 laws if it's the Buddhist rules of human interaction. The legal system is in addition to the laws of human culture. For the few percentage of people who break one or another of those laws of human culture, the legal system is there to protect the citizenry from the breaking of those laws. There's no way on God's green earth that the legal system can provide the framework for humane society in and of itself. You just can't create enough rules. And we are now debating whether an artistic baker can refuse to bake a cake. It's no longer under discussion, unfortunately. But the question before the Supreme Court was, can a person who expresses his creativity by designing cakes refuse to bake a cake and design a cake for a couple where both of the members of the couple were of the same gender? The artist could not express his creativity for that kind of project. And he was taken to court, and it went to the Supreme Court. It was the expression of an absurd principle of law to work out this problem, which is really a cultural problem, where neither side respected the autonomy of the other side. That's a different issue. Now, I had a flight of fancy for a moment. The culture, now I've regained it. Soros said, I cannot and do not consider the social implications of my actions. The trader said, I long for a down market because I want to make money on it. Now, there was a time when if a person, I want to pick the right metaphor. There was a time when if I dropped my wallet on the street and somebody saw it and came and picked it up and ran after me and handed it to me, I would have been very pleased and gratified. I would have offered him a minor reward, and he would have refused it. And we would have both gone on our way, content that culture was working the way it really ought to. That time is long gone. Now, if somebody finds my wallet and reports to the news agency that he's found my wallet with the name Paul Meyer in it, he is touted as a marvelous, good example to our culture for sound and responsible behavior. What has become laudatory now used to be the norm. Catherine Austin Fitts rightly says that the popsicle index goes up when the stock market goes down, and the stock market goes up as the popsicle index goes down. She's got a complex formula. The popsicle index is the index, or the percentage of people in the neighborhood who think a child can leave home, go to the nearest store and buy a popsicle or a candy bar, and come home safely. If you've got a stable culture with parents who look out for one another's kids and who know when there's a stranger sitting in the car down the block, that popsicle index is going to be close to 100. If, on the other hand, you've got a neighborhood with 3 drug dealers on one corner and another drug dealer on an opposite corner, and not only do the kids stay in, but the women stay in or walk the streets in pairs, your popsicle index is pretty close to 0. Unfortunately, the way the economy in the United States is run, your popsicle index is going to be close to zero when there's a lot of money, including dirty money and including drug money, in the stock market. I ask you to go to the website. I think the name of the book is Dillon and Read and Company, Incorporated, and the Aristocracy of Stock Profits. It's available in PDF form, and you'll have to Google it to find the name of the website. But Catherine Fitz wrote it. And two remarkable things are evident in the book that she wrote. One is that the power of the matrix that I showed you. Remember the matrix of corporations, of individual people in the corporations? That matrix applies not only where you have visible lines of power, but where you have invisible lines of power. Note, Ms. Fitz comments on a leadership choice that the director of Dillon Read made. And it came out that the Rothschild group, which does not own Dillon Read, picked that leadership. And Catherine Austin Fitz told her boss, "What do the Rothschilds have to do with making this selection? They don't own us." And her boss looked at her and said, basically shook his head. He was saying to her that she was so naive that it wasn't worth explaining. That the Rothschild influence in financial markets was such that they didn't have to own Dillon Read in order to control what Dillon Read did. Okay? That's one point of that matrix of power. The other point is, as in the book, she talks about as she was trying to work her way up in the ladder of success at Dillon Read, she was told that she needed to join the Council on Foreign Relations, and in order to do so, she needed to ask her boss to sponsor her. And Fitz knew a certain amount about the CFR, and she said, I'm not comfortable with doing that. And the person who was giving her this advice said, "You don't understand. You don't get in this group. You don't move up." The power structure is such. It is very jealous to protect its membership, and it's very jealous to protect its power. And the higher you go up on that pyramid, the more jealous they become at protecting their power and protecting their membership. Lastly, I hate it when I get my thought chain gets interrupted. Not Ethel Warren, Elizabeth Warren was told by Larry Summers, "You can criticize the insiders if you wish, but you'll never be listened to. Or you can become an insider, and they will listen to you, and they might take your suggestions. But the number one rule that Mr. Summers shared with Elizabeth Warren was insiders don't criticize insiders." You're talking about a very elite club, and that elite club is protective of its privileges and protective of its position. There's one other thing about Dillon Read, and that I wanted. Oh, the red button. The red button. Fitz is, and when it comes to money matters, Fitz is right up there with Michael Hudson. She has, since having a very colorful career on Wall Street and with the Ronald Reagan administration, subsequently started lecturing on responsible money management. Good woman. In one of her presentations, she described how much dirty money and drug money is in the American economy propping up the stock market. Investment depends on liquidity, and liquidity depends on money, and money comes from a variety of sources, and the amount of money invested in the stock market that is laundered is enormous. She presented this set of facts to a group of socially responsible people who wanted to do good things with their investments. And she proposed this to them. If I have a red button here, and if you push that red button, you could eliminate all of the drug traffic in the United States. Magic red button, obviously. How many of you would push it? Out of 100 participants in the conference, one person would push it. We have reached a point in American culture, I regret to say this, I'm enormously sad to say it. It's a common statement that Americans know the price of everything and the value of nothing. That is sufficient. We are no longer talking about the 200 or 2,000 members of those corporate boards doing what is profitable for them and disregarding the social consequences of what they do. If we are talking about the 200 or 2,000, it might be conceivable that you can get to them and change their cultural value system. But we're talking about those 99% of socially responsible people who were unwilling to purge the United States from drug money because it would affect the value of their stocks, bonds, and savings. Now, let's see how much of this have I actually covered. Any questions so far? I have discussed part of the, come on up here. I think I've described the end goal of the conspiracy. The methodology of the conspiracy goes back to what Inglis is doing, goes back to the consolidation of the media under Bill Clinton. It was in process. If you look at the culture that was established, or that was assumed by the framers of the Constitution, it was already perverted under Jackson, because Jackson was told by the Supreme Court that he had to recognize the nationhood of the Cherokee Nation. And Jackson said, the Supreme Court decided that, let the Supreme Court enforce it. And the Cherokee Nation was driven west of the Mississippi. So in that act, he was claiming North America, not for humanity, but for the white man. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln had the option of letting the southern states go because they didn't want to pay tariffs, or negotiating with them a reasonable adjustment to the tariffs. What did Lincoln's backers want? Lincoln's backers wanted a strong central government that would produce its own currency, to invest in infrastructure, and that would protect the rich from the poor. Now that's a consistent program, because in 1867 you had the Constitution established to protect the rich from the poor and to establish a strong enough central government to control insurrection like the Shays' Rebellion. So I will say that Lincoln was moving on the same path that at least Hamilton was moving in 1867. Were there contrary voices? By all means. Benjamin Franklin said, "We have given you a republic, if you can keep it." The problem of faction, and the ultimate faction, is the rich versus the poor. Benjamin Franklin said, "We give you a republic if you can keep it." And from the very first decision of the Supreme Court, the masses of people started losing it. There are two items that I want to deliver further today. William Binney is one of the smartest guys I have ever known. And William Binney created the program that would have allowed the NSA to vacuum up all sorts of data from foreigners with certain screens that would have protected American citizens, so that any data that included American citizens was excluded from the vacuum process. It would have included a screen so that anyone who looked at that data was recorded, so that the NSA would know what members of the NSA had looked at the data. Binney was proud of the program. He was horrified when he discovered that his bosses turned the program around, and instead of vacuuming up all of the data on potential terrorists, they were vacuuming up all sorts of data from American citizens. And the NSA abandoned those protections. They stopped protecting, they stopped making it impossible to find out or identifying people who were looking at the data, so that anyone could look at the data at the NSA, frankly including anyone else from the federal government. Binney had built in all sorts of protections to protect the legal constitutional rights of American citizens. The NSA had turned it around, basically depriving the American citizen of virtually all constitutional rights. I'm going to show you just a small amount of what Binney has to say, and then I'm going to show you, where is Binney now? Here we go. I'm not going to play all of it, but it's too long, but I want you to see.
Offensive side, and can you tell me how you're designing the defensive side? Because I thought that they should be parallel. You know, what we were doing, they were doing, and they wouldn't tell me. So that shows you the same kind of, there's that kind of communications now, like for example for cybersecurity, all the attacks that have come out of Vault 7 and the NSA exposures, hundreds of millions of lines of source code on attacks on firewalls, switches, servers, operating systems, all that. There's thousands of attacks. And we've only seen a few of them so far used in the world. And you can just be ready for a much rougher ride because the offensive side knew all these things were weak and existing. The defensive side didn't, and they never fixed anything, so we're all vulnerable, so we all got attacked. And so now they say every time you get attacked, we need more money, more people, more empire. You know, so it's a swindle. We're all being swindled by our governments. If they would only fix the things they knew that were wrong, we might have some security, you know. So, but instead they don't. So at any rate, I didn't, when I left NSA, I did that at the end of October 2001 because they started spying on individuals and not groups of bad guys, okay? So that meant they were scooping up everything from everybody in the world. And it's much more extensive than anybody thought. It's more extensive than even these slides show. But because, and in order to store all this material, they had to build the Bluffdale 1 million square foot facility for storing data. And last year, they broke ground for now a 2.8 million square foot facility on Fort Meade. It took out a 36-hole golf course to do it. So, I mean, the point is, if you collect everything, as an ever-increasing amount of data year after year, which means you need ever-increasing data storage facilities to store it all. The way we found out about this was to look at every time the government wants to build something, they have to file an environmentals study. So when they wanted to put in this very large building, they had to also submit an environmental impact statement and study to do it before they did it. So we're looking at those and seeing what they're building. So when they do that, we know, well, this is on Fort Meade and it's NSA doing it, so you know, virtually everything on Fort Meade is NSA anyway. So that gave us the knowledge of the scale of what they're collecting and what they're assembling. For example, in Cisco, who sold them the routers to route data to the Utah facility, estimated, there was a small article they wrote years ago that estimated that by 2015, the amount of data going into the Utah facility would be 966 exabytes a year. That's about a zettabyte. So that's why originally, years ago, I estimated that the capacity of Utah was about 5 zettabytes. I mean, it's my guess, you know, it's a lot of bytes anyway. So at any rate, I felt I didn't have to take anything with me because everybody in Congress, when I left, you know, they all knew me, they knew what I was doing. Most of what they're doing to spy on everybody, I designed anyway or had a hand in it. So they knew all that. So I felt I didn't have to bring any material out to validate anything I was saying because they all knew I did it. So I naively thought that I could do that and go complain through the channels, the intelligence committees and the inspector generals, and they would all take some action on it. Well, what it really meant was when it came time to actually hearing what I had to say, Congress never invited me in. I mean, I testified in the Bundestag, I testified in the House of Lords in the UK, but the Congress would never hear me because then they'd lose plausible deniability.
I'm going to stop there. Vinny's major complaint, well, that may not be fair. One of Bill's major points is that when they have a problem with their sweeping operation and they have a leak or whatever, instead of fixing the problems with the system, they ask for more money. And Bill assumes, as a normal, ethical, decent human being, that the system is intended to identify and capture bad guys. That's the reason he designed it. He does not ask the very simple question, maybe that's not its design. Maybe instead of capturing bad guys, it's intended to categorize good guys. What if its goal is to get so much information on Janet so that if she ever steps out of line and they want to pin something on her, they've got so much data on her that they can create a charge. She breaks 3 laws a day without knowing it. I probably break 5 laws a day without knowing it, and everyone in this room, because of our legal system, whether you drive or not, in fact, if you drive, you probably break a few more, you break laws because of our legal system every day, and when they want to, they can haul up and find out which laws you broke and accuse you of them. Paul Craig Roberts, unfortunately, rightly says that the legal system is designed to produce convictions, not justice. And prosecutors make their reputation on their conviction rate. And if you can save the court money, even better. So that if you've got someone who may or may not have done crime A. But if you pile crime B, C, D, and E, which has greater penalties, you might get the person to plead guilty to the lesser charge in order to avoid years in jail for the more serious charge. The rate of incarceration is vastly higher in the last 20 or 30 years than it was prior to that time, which correlates amazingly with the transition to hiring private firms for incarceration over against publicly financed incarceration. I'm going to play one last
So, the American people know exactly who's trying to buy our elected official. So, here's a crazy thing. Almost everyone I know agrees that the government of the United States, the government of the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, is completely broken.
But is it? Or is it doing exactly what the people who control the government want it to do?
And for most of us, it's really obvious why. Lobbyists write our laws, politicians are bought, and corruption is infecting every issue that's close to our hearts. But what's even crazier is that we've all convinced ourselves that there's nothing we can do about it. And that is one of the biggest and most dangerous lies in American politics. The problem isn't that corrupt politicians are breaking the law. The problem is that we don't even have laws for them to break.
And the problem also, if we don't have laws for them to break, the laws that are on the books are not enforced. During the savings and loan crisis, the Department of Justice had referred to it something like 900 criminals from the savings and loan, many of whom were prosecuted and incarcerated. No one has been incarcerated for financial fraud in the 2008 debacle. But that's not the... I wanted to demonstrate for you this is one.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they...
Remember what the trader said. Governments don't run things, Goldman Sachs does.
Want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America. Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist-written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists, those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. And that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200
return for every dollar
Never mind
invested.
every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will. The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal. We already know Congress won't do it. I mean, one look at this chart will tell you that. What we need is a plan that lets us go around Congress and do what the American people do best. Fix this mess ourselves. Well, good news. We have that plan and it's already working. Now that we've got the problem covered, let us show you how to be part of the solution.
Write that down, because there are 2 websites that you may want to look at. Represent.us and Rutherford.org. Rutherford.org is the website for the Rutherford Institute, the head of which is John Whitehead. And John Whitehead is a lawyer who does excellent work in terms of exposing the fact that the legal system is not working for the people. It is working for A, wealthy, B, special interests, C, government employees. It is working as a police state, not as a protector of the citizenry. I'm going to stop there. This is a very gloomy picture, and as I would tell
I'd say you got the title of this course right.
Pardon me?
You got the title of this course right.
Yes, yes. The good news is that you can protect yourself The good news is that you can make a contribution, and the bad news is that in protecting yourself, you will work for yourself for the future, but the probability of changing our culture is slim to none. Questions? Comments? Dawn, you usually have an insightful question or two.
Well, I heard something that I found very interesting, and that's that the U.S. military salary is 1/10 to 1/100 what the mercenaries get for the same jobs. So that, for me, that fits right into the idea of privatizing the public commons, and in this case, including the money that would go to support people who are working for the government in legitimate things, including what you said about prisons, are being replaced by employees of private industries. So our tax money is funding the CEO compensation for those industries, as well as employees that are replacing people who were formerly employees of the government. So I guess maybe, Paul, I disagree a little bit about government employees having a lot of influence, unless you go clear to the top rank.
Yeah. And that, I probably should have, I don't instantly edit my comments as they are coming out on public employees. I'm talking about the Elizabeth Warren level, not the grunt level, or for that matter, Bill Springfield attempted to do a good job as a State Department employee at the consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And he was fired from his job by calling attention to the fact that a host of Arab questionable people were being issued visas to the United States in the late 90s and before 9/11. Basically, they were being given fast-tracked to get visas to get into the United States on the premise, presumably, of getting their accelerated terrorist training in the United States. And Bill Springfield lost his job by questioning the issuing of visas to these people who looked like potential terrorists. It's often the case that people who want to do their jobs get shafted. Sibel Edmonds was in that category. Will Binney was in that category. Thomas Drake is in that category. Trying to think of the one who actually went to prison. The one person who went to prison because of the revealing of state secrets went to prison because he made known the fact that crimes were being committed. He didn't commit the crime. The crimes were being committed by other members of the federal government, and he went to jail because he made that known.
But isn't that all Snowden did? Was what Benny said, that they're using it on private citizens? What was it? Snowden, how was...
Snowden came after Binney, and right. Snowden revealed information he revealed it to 2 reporters and 2 newspapers, and the United States government would love to arrest him and put him on trial, but it'd probably be a closed trial, for revealing secure information, but information that was embarrassing to the United States government, not information that was detrimental to the interest of the people of the United States. So I don't know if I answered your query or comment or not.
Because it wasn't Snowden just saying how this information was being used, like Binney told us in this. Isn't that all Snowden did, or he did specific information?
He gave specific embarrassing information. And at that, unfortunately, probably because of the people to whom he gave it, only something like 5 or 10% of what he has given them has been published. And you can speculate as to why the other 90% hasn't been published. Because the two reporters and the two newspapers to whom he gave the information have vested political interests of their own. I'm very pessimistic about changing the decline of the culture. I'm very hopeful about getting at least some people awake so that they can remain sane in an insane situation.
So there's your positive side.
Thank you for being here and for your questions and your interest.
Thank you.
And Bob and Ann, if we discussed the nature of the conspiracy this week, I hope we can get to why the American public tolerates it and what we can do about it next week. I hope.
Warrantless, I mean, who's going to benefit from that? There's not.
Repeat, Russ?
The Warrantless Surveillance Act that the Congress, or the House just passed.
I'm glad they passed it because at least now they've legalized what the government has been doing for the last 15 years.
Illegal, but
I'd rather they do it legally rather than illegally. Then the absurdity is to think that the government works exactly the way the people who run the government want it to work. The issue is, how do you deceive enough of the people enough of the time so that they don't make a noise about it? George Bush was determined to go to war with Iraq. And in spite of the fact that something like 30 million people filling the streets of the world's cities did not deter him. If, on the other hand, 30 million Americans had filled the streets and had told their representatives, if you go to war, we will demand Bush's impeachment and we will vote you out of office, guess what? It wouldn't have happened. The power really is in the hands of the people. The system, do you all know who Temple Grandin is? Temple Grandin is a marvelous woman with autism, and she has successfully overcome a number of the barriers to autism. Her initial contribution to humanity was in recognizing what it was about cattle chutes that terrified the cattle while they were going to slaughter. Now, I personally consider this a humane contribution, if not to the cattle, at least to the human species. So that she was able to reconstruct the cattle chutes so that they didn't create terror in the cattle as they were going to the slaughter. The ruling oligarchs are looking for a pattern to duplicate for the human species what Temple Grandin did for the cattle.
And the argument against her that a lot of animal activists make is that if she has all that much power, why doesn't she use it to make the entire existence of the animals before slaughter more humane?
That's an excellent question, and if I were Temple Grandin, I hope I would have the courage to answer it. But people put walls up in their lives and in their consciousness. One of the things that we will take a look at some future date is the similarity and differences between people like Winston Churchill and Dr. Mengele and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the people who firebombed Japan in comparison to the people who ran the forced labor camps in Germany. Because part of our American historical mythology is that the Nazis were terrible demonic creatures, and we were the good guys. And the Americans and the British, with some contribution, won the Second World War. And when you look at Norman Dodd's interview, the first project of the foundations was to change the way American history is taught. Because if you really understand history, you're much less susceptible to the propaganda. And they wanted a product that would buy the propaganda.
Now they just came out with a new Churchill movie with great actor Gary Oldman that is going to show how wonderful Churchill was, I'm sure. You know, that's what we need right now. It's a Churchill movie.
I will play for you, and again in a subsequent program, Jimmy Moglia's description, and it's detailed, the description of the firebombing of Dresden. It's unfortunately graphic, but unless we understand what, quote, we have done, we don't begin to understand history. Thank you.